Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for a design subcommittee meeting of the Boston Civic Design Commission. Today's date is Tuesday, December 17th, and this is session B of the BCDC Design Subcommittee. The Planning Department continues hosting public meetings in a virtual setting for the health, safety, and accessibility of Boston residents. I am Christina Rico, Executive Director of the BCDC and Senior Urban Designer at the City of Boston Planning Department. Before we proceed with the agenda, the open meeting law requires that I notify the public that this meeting is being recorded. Therefore, please be aware that Commission staff is making an audio and video recording of this meeting. Please turn off your camera and microphone if you do not wish to be recorded. For the purposes of the record, Commissioners Eastley, Gillies-Smith, Haseen, and Sykes have joined us this evening. And we may be joined later by Commissioner Koteridis. Tonight's agenda will include a presentation for the 10-year institutional master plan for Northeastern University. Tonight's meeting proceedings will follow the typical BCDC Design Subcommittee meeting format, beginning with a brief presentation from the proponent, comments from the commissioners, followed by public testimony. And again, I just want to make a note here for anybody who may has joined looking for the project 22 Dry Dock Avenue. That's actually in session A. So I believe, Clace, you are in the wrong session. Okay. So with that, Victoria and team, have you all been appropriately promoted to co-host?
I believe so.
Okay, I just have a really brief intro here and then I'll hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
A proposed 10-year institutional master plan for Northeastern University seeking Article 80D entitlement contemplates approximately 2.25 million square feet of new construction and approximately 935,000 square feet of renovation in 8 proposed institutional projects. This will be the first presentation of the proposed IMP to the Design Subcommittee following an introduction at the monthly meeting on June 25th, 2024. It's my understanding that there are no commissioners present who intend to recuse themselves from deliberations. A reminder to proponent teams that presentations will be limited, although this is the only agenda item, so I'm happy to go long on the timer. We'll give you a 2-minute warning after you've, let's say 20 minutes have elapsed. And with that, I invite the proponent team to begin presenting whenever they're ready.
All right, thank you, Christina. Give me one sec. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, so thank you for being here. My name is Corey Berg and I am the Director of Campus Planning. I'm joined by my colleagues, Victoria Avelina, Associate Vice President of Campus Planning and Design, and John Tobin, Vice President of City and Community Engagement. I'm also joined by a number of our consultants from Sasaki and Howard Stein Hudson, who will be giving a portion of the presentation. So thank you again for the commissioners for your time this evening. I'd also like to thank the planning department staff for their continued support and guidance on this project. We are here to discuss the institutional master plan renewal that we filed back on June 14th, 2024. And as you know, we're concurrently undergoing review for our 262 St. Botolph Street multi-purpose athletic facility. It's a long one. But since our last discussion with BCDC on the project in June, we've also held 2 task force meetings, one back in July and the second a week ago on December 10th, following the receipt of our scoping determination on November 26th. So I'll go through a little bit of what we heard from that scoping determination and look forward to the discussion. So the last time we were with you all back in June, the feedback that we heard was we need to continue to drive home these high-level planning principles that will be shaping the master plan. You'll see that we've carried that through the presentation today. We also heard a desire to talk a little bit more about the edges and how our campus connects to the city along its along the edges of the campus and the connections it's making towards the community. Was also a desire to hear a little bit more about our open space network, how our buildings are situated within this open space network, and discuss a little bit of the connectivity between the spaces and degree of publicness of these various open spaces. We also have had a lens towards accessibility for these open spaces and entry points into our buildings off of the open spaces that we've carried through into some of this work. And then a little bit about Huntington Avenue and the discussion, particularly as it relates to Whitehall along Heights and the experience that you would have along that corridor. So like I said, we received our scoping determination at the end of November. Thank you for the city staff who contributed to that. But we heard some really great feedback as well there. One major theme was thinking about housing and the percentage of students that we might house as an institution, how to hold that constant or increase that figure as an effort moving forward into the next decade. We also heard a little bit about how to reduce the need for additional IMP amendments. In response to that, we've really tried to focus on capital renewal as another kind of thrust of our master plan and how we might try to plan for some of that in this coming decade by incorporating a number of planned renovations in addition to new redevelopment sites. Alignment with some citywide plans, including the Fenway Transportation Action Plan and other transportation plans was raised, and echoing a lot of the concerns and discussion we heard here in the BCDC forum, talking about open space improvements, access, and public edges. Our tree inventory and the Arboretum was something that was also highlighted, how we might continue to kind of celebrate that as we look forward to the next decade. And then a big focus on sustainability and our goals surrounding zero net carbon, energy efficiency, reduction of embodied carbon, especially as we think about deconstruction of our facilities, what that looks like, our goals around green buildings and climate adaptation planning. We also, from an urban form perspective, there was some great direction and feedback regarding the Avenue of the Arts, shadows, setbacks, podiums, and sidewalks along that major corridor, Huntington Avenue. So a lot of great feedback that we are still processing, but we're sharing with you all today some of our initial thoughts as it relates to all of this feedback that we've received to date. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marianne. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marianne Ocampo, and I am a principal at Sasaki, who's been collaborating with Northeastern for a couple years on this IMP. I'm very happy to be with y'all tonight. And I'll start with saying that we are, of course, guided by 5 planning principles that encompass an attitude towards flexibility and agility. As we think about the Boston campus, it's part of a global network for Northeastern, so understanding how that functions physically relative to what we're accommodating for the student experience is very important. Impactful learning and collaboration as we promote collaborative, interdisciplinary kind of research and experiential learning with the cooperatives. We want to be mindful of how that's celebrated on the campus. Inclusion and belonging and understanding that individuals of all backgrounds can thrive. How can we make sure the physical environment is accessible and welcoming? We also want to look at sustainability and resilience and understanding the institution's role within the kind of ways in which they're implementing just solutions to address the climate crisis. So energy, understanding tree canopies, stormwater, flooding, so forth. And then last, our 5th principle is focused on connection and community and thinking about the physical investments of social infrastructure and how those are actually functioning and how they contribute to a larger kind of effort relative to our adjacent neighbors and how they prosper and stay and thrive. So these are leading us in our kind of design strategies and planning efforts. Now on the next slide, our proposed plan shows the kind of physical transformation of the campus that we're projecting in the next 10 years. What you'll notice is that the white buildings show the Northeastern proposed new buildings that we're putting forward in this IMP. In the kind of darker mauve color, you can see those are the existing buildings. And then the lighter color, those are renovated buildings that we're really thinking about how can we renovate these facilities to be better relative to the user experience and the ways that we're thinking about energy and so forth. And then what you'll also notice is that the yellow represents the different circulation paths. And then of course you see the trees and open space that make up part of that public realm and open space network that we'll talk about throughout the next couple minutes. So on the next slide, I think that we want to also highlight to the group that there are three major areas of change that are coming forward in this most recent kind of iteration of the master plan. Number one, what you'll see is where Whitehall was located. It's currently has been demolished. We are looking at 21 Forsyth Street as number one, being a building form that we are studying as we've been working with the city to think about the kind of shadow impacts based off the height of that building and how it's impacting the kind of open space to the north across from Hemingway. And so understanding what that kind of impact is and kind of studying that urban form. The second change that we'll note here is Bursting Rubenstein to the left, number two. And this was formerly considered to be an academic site, but working with the city again, thinking about housing, we need to accommodate more student housing. So that's going to be a site where we're changing the use to student housing. And then third, to the right of your screen, what you'll see is Mugar and Colonnane was a configuration that we studied during the IMPNF submittal. And now we are changing the site configuration where we are now looking at Colonnane and Hertig, which you see here, combining those two building sites as one because of the way that we've been thinking about phasing in the current uses and what can work for the institution. So first and foremost, we want to revisit the big ideas that we've put forth in the past. And the first big idea for us, which is structuring our whole presentation, is immersive and inclusive learning. And how can we think about expanding the learning network, research network, as we think about the whole campus? And so here you see this big idea of distributing different uses across the Northeastern campus. What you see on the next slide is we want to think about the strategic location and synergies of where we're reinforcing the academic core. So with the building projects that we're putting forth, you can see that really part of the academic core is made up of research that you see in the cyan color. The darker blue color represents the academics. And so we're reinforcing where that academic and research clustering is happening. On the left side of your screen, more so, you can see along Forsyth Street, that is a cluster where Cabot is located today, the UR complex and Forsyth, those buildings, redeveloping that as a major academic and research heart. A second cluster is to the east in what we're calling the East End. And this is where Colonnane and Hertig, as well as Gainsborough, are located and creating a second concentration there. And then, of course, from the previous IMP in 2013, a third cluster exists with the ISAC building and EXP really to the south on Columbus. And so understanding how that's working to the south. What you'll also notice as far as the way that we're thinking about student housing is that you're seeing that 21 Forsyth, also known as Whitehall, Bursting Rubenstein, and of course 840 Columbus start to show where we're putting student housing on the periphery of campus, and then recognizing that the magenta color, that pink color, is representative of student life. So we want to activate every ground floor that we can with proposed new development to really emphasize the activity of maker spaces, lounges, social spaces, study spaces that would activate a lot of the ground floors that you're seeing with all the proposed new development, as well as acknowledging the multi-purpose facility where Matthews Arena is located today to the east. On the next slide, what you'll see is that the big I number 2 is sustainable and resilient public realm. And this is about strengthening the network of open spaces and paths to really think about the ecology, the environmental kind of systems, as well as the social infrastructure of how people are moving across through and to Northeastern, as well as thinking about the series of open spaces that we're improving within the campus context. So on the next slide, what you'll see is that existing open space network. Notable are Centennial Commons, Krinsman Quad, but you can see in the pale yellow, those existing paths, as well as the kind of network of open spaces that make up this urban institutions campus. On the following slide, what you'll see is our proposed open space network. So as we're thinking about this open space network, we're transforming the open space so that it's creating better connections across the different open spaces. And notable for the kind of proposed is we'll start with the west side, looking at bursting Rubenstein and really thinking about how we widen the sidewalks in the corner along Huntington so that we have an appropriate setback and a wider public realm. You'll notice if we move from there towards Huntington, you'll see a diagonal that shows towards the UR complex, a kind of rethinking of a former street, Greenleaf Street, into more of a pedestrian zone and landscape there. At 21 Forsyth Street, we're emphasizing connectivity toward the Back Bay bend, or to the bend, sorry, and thinking about how we increase the kind of width of Huntington Avenue as part of that pedestrian public realm. Now, a big move for us relative to the open space network is the diagonal from Forsyth Street and Huntington, where those intersect, and then rethinking this kind of gateway landscape near Cabot and Forsyth, and starting to do a diagonal that weaves from that intersection straight down into what is the library as well as the student center. And so rethinking how development would reinforce and activate this diagonal open space towards that kind of hub of activity between library and student center. With what you'll notice to the east on the right side is that we're also rethinking Robinson Quad and how the Curry Student Center begins to orient itself with pedestrians moving up towards St. Botolph, towards Gainsborough, and to St. Botolph, the new multi-purpose arena, and thinking about the public realm along Gainsborough Street. So these are the major areas of improvement that we're focused on for open space with the IMP. Now, part of this study has also been observing and analyzing what the barriers to inclusion are as we think about the public realm. And so this is a very quick snapshot that shows you Centennial Common and how we are thinking about Krinsman, Centennial, and other open spaces and how they're not working. This includes materiality, pathways that are not accessible, the curbing that takes place and how those curbs are working and preventing people from actually getting on the lawn. So it's because it's not accessible, areas of rest, places where people sit, thinking about lighting and all of those things that you see here are part of our kind of study of accessibility on the campus. Now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Krista, who will talk a little bit more about mobility.
I see Krista here, but I don't know if she was elevated to a speaker. Krista Lucas.
Oh, let me see if I can do it actually.
Yeah, I see it. Just a co-host now. Krista, you should be able to
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you,
Yes.
and you can turn on your.
I'm working on it.
Works.
There
Sorry.
she is.
Yeah, I'm switching between screens and things. So my apologies. I just a second. Sorry.
Oh, good.
Okay. Sorry about that. Technological difficulties. Good evening. I'm Krista Lucas, and I'm a senior transportation engineer with Howard Stein Hudson. Public transportation is an important mode of access for students, faculty, staff, and visitors. Nearly half of all commuting faculty and staff use transit, and half of commuting students use transit. Northeastern has excellent transit access and 5 MBTA stations within and around the campus, with the campus sitting atop Ruggles Station, an intermodal hub with commuter rail, Orange Line, and bus connections. The MBT Green Line on Huntington Avenue runs north on the northwest edge of the campus, and the campus is conveniently located amidst 15 MBTA bus stops. Next slide, please. Northeastern will continue to support the bicycle network and shared bicycle facilities in the area. The campus is situated between 2 of Boston's great path systems, the Fens and the Southwest Corridor. Improvements have been made along Columbus Avenue as well, and a shared bus bike path was recently installed on Huntington Avenue between Brigham Circle and Gainsborough. The university has significantly increased on-campus bicycle storage from 141 bicycles at 8 locations in 2000 to approximately 2,000 spaces at 40 locations throughout the campus today. And Northeastern will continue with each new building it's planned to continue to build internal bike rooms and external visitor bike racks and to support the Blue Bike system. Next slide, please. Within the institutional master plan, Northeastern plans to improve permeability through the campus for pedestrians. Improved pedestrian connections will be low stress with improved landscaping and lighting. Northeastern intends to continue improving the public network along the city streets of Huntington Ave and Forsyth Street, as Mary Ann already mentioned. Improvements also are planned for the internal campus network in coordination with the open space network. So that path diagonally from Huntington Avenue to Forsyth Street, between St. Botolph and the Student Center, and along Greenleaf. Sorry, now I've just lost
Sorry,
my
I clicked too fast too. My bad.
It's okay. Finally, as part of the institutional master plan, Northeastern will maintain existing service corridors. One major service corridor is located behind the campus along the Orange Line, tucked behind the buildings. Service access will continue to be modified as necessary for newly proposed buildings, continuing to avoid impacts and conflicts with primary vehicular access routes, such as Huntington Avenue, as well as separated from pedestrian corridors to reduce those conflicts as well. And I will pass it back to Mary Ann.
Thank you, Krista. And so as we move forward to big idea number 3, a campus within the city, the next slide starts to show active corridors and how we celebrate this urban institution being located within Boston, but how we contribute to the city in regards to those active corridors and redevelopment that's happening and how we're really thinking about the public realm, while also understanding the mix of uses that are adjacent to us as we think about the different edge conditions, and how we're beginning to kind of understand the porosity in areas of activity. So on the next slide, what you'll see is edges in context, and this shows those proposed redevelopment sites as well as the open space in the public realm. But what you also know in the kind of circular concentric circle diagrams, you'll see that there is a series of active nodes, and these are really hubs of activity that we're planning for relative to those ground floor uses. And how those are activating these major corridors and public realm kind of moments. What you also see is the dark red shows the active edges that exist through other kind of existing uses, but also how we're going to reinforce that relative to those ground floor uses in the new development sites. On the next slide, we also wanted to get into the way that we're thinking about the campus communities or neighborhoods or districts, and really emphasizing with zoom ins of the east end that you can see here on the right side of your slide, and also Forsyth, what you see in red relative to Forsyth Park and Forsyth Street and the development that's occurring within this kind of new academic and research hub. So moving to the next slide, we'll start then with the East End. What you can see here is Mugar and Cullinane and Hertig, taking note that before we talked about Mugar and Cullinane, but we're going to reconfigure the site so that it's Cullinane and Hertig, as well as Gainsborough and the multi-purpose facility. On the next slide, what you see is the proposed East End and how we're accommodating research uses with lab space, academics, as well as recreational spaces with the development that you see in white located here. And as we move to the next slide, what you'll notice is the ground floor uses of what those active edges are relative to where we're seeing future buildings, understanding this as kind of a zoning envelope of the capacity of what could actually be located here, but understanding those active edges through the black dark lines that you see there, that front all the new kind of pedestrian paths and entries and streets that you see. And if we go on the next slide, you'll see then the kind of circulation networks that we are creating relative to the orange and yellow, showing pedestrian kind of circulation that fronts along St. Botolph, as well as Gainsborough Street with these three new developments. And what you'll also know is that the service access is seen in blue, with where those service entries would be located along this kind of alleyway south of Gainsborough, Cullinane, and Hertig, that street servicing from that side of the MBTA train track. So if we move to the other campus community, going quickly, because I know we're probably at time very soon, the existing Forsyth Street kind of park area, we're calling it, shows Forsyth Street as a major spine. You can see that the existing conditions here is that Cabot is pretty monolithic, as well as Forsyth and the UR complex, and how those existing buildings engage or maybe don't engage with the public realm as we think about Huntington and Forsyth Street. If we move to the next slide, this reinvigorated way in which we're understanding academics and research and student life amenities are seen with housing at 21 Forsyth, and then the rest of the buildings really focused on academics and research for the institution, as well as a series of public realm moves that we're making through improved open spaces and pathways. As we move to the plan view, we can see a zoom in of this area where you see the active edges, where we have buildings that are fronting many sides relative to Huntington and Forsyth, but also reinforcing that diagonal Gateway Plaza and new public realm that allows people to flow from that intersection of Huntington Avenue and Forsyth down towards Churchill Center, Sir Curry Student Center, as well as Snell Library. And then also thinking about a diagonal that's coming from Huntington towards the kind of active edge of the UR complex and where Greenleaf Street is located today. If we go to the next slide, you'll see again in the kind of orange and yellow, the main pedestrian circulation, where we're seeing those building entries, as well as where service would be located and feeding into those buildings and how they operate with research and academic functions. Great. Thank you, everyone. That was a quick snapshot of our process thus far.
Commissioners, I just want to acknowledge that Commissioner Kotorides has joined us. And I don't know if Commissioner Gilly Smith mentioned earlier, but she'll have a hard stop at 6 o'clock if we're ordering our comments here.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to the team. Marianne, I wonder if you can show us those massing before and afters just one more time. There was so much good information in there, and I think we were all trying to digest as quickly as we could.
Yes, sure thing.
Sorry to make everyone dizzy. So you're saying for these 3 sites?
No, it was in,
And
Yeah.
the slides were in the 20s. Like this is slide 7, and the ones that I was hoping we could see the before and afters were kind of
Oh,
into.
gotcha. Okay.
24 and 25 will show the existing East End and proposed East End. So we can
Yeah, so this
take
is
a
your
look at those. Yeah, right. So just to give a little bit more time on these, is that some of the kind of information, again, reconfiguring Hertig and Cullinane as one site, this particular zoning envelope and kind of giving a sense of massing here, is really looking at about 300,000 gross square feet, at 13 floors and a height of 195 feet for the Hertig and Cullinane configuration there. Gainsborough, that site, is approximately 250,000 gross square feet, at a height of 150 feet at 10 floors, and has, again, academics and some recreational spaces that we need, such as a pool, that could be located there. And then, of course, Perkins and Wills project with St. Botolph Street and Northeastern. You can see the latest massing that we're reflecting diagrammatically there.
And you just show us kind of 24, 25, 24, 25, just kind of go back and forth and then do the same with the other setting.
Sorry.
Okay.
And then I'll flip to, I'll just sorry to go back to the East End. Marianne kind of hinted at this, but a big part of the idea here is that we need to enable the redevelopment of the Forsyth neighborhood through the redevelopment of the arena. Sorry, my mouse is clicking. The arena, which will take some of the program from our current Cabot Center, pull it into this multi-purpose athletic facility, and then the pool, which we also need to pull from the Cabot Center. It's not in the arena project, but that is kind of an unlocking, enabling piece that would need to happen here. And then the idea with Hertig being a redevelopment site now is that that building is currently vacant. We relocated a lot of that program to enable our EXP building. And so the idea is that that could be a first piece to kind of building out a research facility here. I'll go now to the Forsyth neighborhood here.
That's so helpful. Thank you for going back to those slides. Kirk, I see your hand up, and then David, and then Shauna, just to, I know we want to accommodate you before you have to slip off at 6 o'clock as well.
I can wait for Shauna if she wants to go first.
No. I can. We have 20 minutes.
Okay.
So.
All right. Great. Well, thank you. It's like drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of information here. And for my part, I found the plan diagrams more helpful for me, especially say the cross campus. If you go to the 4 cross campus corridors that you showed early on, probably about 10 slides in or less, there was kind of a green lines cutting across the campus. Okay, yeah, I think if you could zoom in a little of that. So I thought this diagram was really helpful. What I'd love to see is where this diagram meets the green spaces in a little more granularity, so that, because I find the axonometric views difficult to discern the character of the space. It seems like a lot of interstitial space that's kind of filling in between existing and proposed buildings. But these are very clear routes that you are articulating, and the next kind of iteration, I think, would zoom in to just the yellow lines and the campus itself and sort of show how it intersected the open spaces and how those open spaces interacted with the buildings. So that's That's one comment. The second comment had to do with the bike accessibility diagram you had, which I think showed more about where the city, where your system interacted with the city system. What I don't quite know is what the through campus system is for bikes. And I'm a huge cyclist, and I rode through the BU Law School today, and it's clear there are bikes and people and conflicts and stuff, and it would be great to understand how you get between the two red lines through your campus if you're getting there by bike, as a lot of students do, and how do you manage pedestrian conflicts that may arise as you're looking at those green arrows that you showed on the prior diagram. Those are my two comments. I think I also will say that I think I just number the buildings, because it doesn't matter what the name is. What matters is the function. I think you had some diagrams that sort of showed that, but it's very hard for me to toggle between the macro and micro scales, at least the way it's done, because I don't quite understand what porosity means to you on a ground plane of a building. And so maybe it means zooming into a couple of buildings and understanding really how the building opens up to the outside. What is the character of that toolkit that will invite people into the building or invite people out of the building into those spaces that you're creating. So let me stop there and let my fellow commissioners comment. Thanks.
David, do you want to go ahead, or
Sure.
Kirk, did you want to get some responses, since this is kind of our roll up our sleeves subcommittee? Do you want to get some responses?
Sure. I mean, if there are some quick response, that's just my personal perspective, but I'd be happy to hear what the team thinks.
That's really
Yeah.
helpful. Oh no, go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, I just want to respond to one of the easiest one to tackle is the micro idea of, if you think of our newest buildings on Columbus, that are both research makerspace buildings. We intentionally programmed the ground floors to be activated by students, have a lot of shared public spaces, and have activity like classrooms that are very open, and you could see the active uses, cafe. In the case with the newest maker building, EXP, we have a large makerspace that opens fully on Columbus Avenue. So the idea really for porosity is bringing programs that are student focused and open, kind of active uses, so that you can see all of the exciting work and activities that are happening on the campus. Because a lot of our more legacy buildings are very inward facing, and they're actually elevated 1 to sometimes 1.5 stories up above ground. So the idea is, how can you actually take these legacy buildings and adapt them to be more accessible and pervious and have activity that can be seen? Those are the renovation projects. And then with development of new buildings, can you ensure that student focused, open, kind of both physically, architecturally, but also from a programming perspective, that it's open for the entire campus and not just for the individual users in the building?
And I would just say that my comment is about not only being seen, but being accessed. And
Right.
International Student Cafeteria is a great example. You can see in, but you can't get there. And so, the cadence and the rhythm of the ability to flow into the building on these buildings is as important as the ability to see into them in my mind. But let me stop.
We're in agreement there.
Thanks.
David?
Sure. I mean, I have mostly questions that hopefully we can talk about. Obviously, it's a huge project. By the way, there's so much information here, and I think you've done a wonderful job of explaining it as clearly as possible. And I must say, from my first introduction, I think now I understand some of the massing goals in terms of these nodes and zones of influence much better from your presentation than I did the first time we talked about white and so forth. So that's super helpful. I guess two thoughts. One is, as someone who's walked through the campus a lot, it is disorienting, especially around the student center and that whole zone. Um, and I think that the diagrams are very small, at least on my computer. And I think it would be helpful in the same way that we were able to toggle before and afters on the massing. If not everywhere, but if on some of those key new connections that you're trying to create, those diagonals that you were talking about, and the connection from the new housing on Huntington, through, if you could sort of illustrate with a before and after what some of those key connections are trying to accomplish in the same way that you used a photograph to explain why so much of the site wasn't accessible. I would find that extremely helpful, just in terms of being able to give some visual sense of what my experience is going to be like moving, or anybody's experience is going to be like moving through those spaces. So maybe for each of those key connections, I think there were 4 of them, having 1 or 2 before after slides, I think would be very helpful. Really to understand your goals more than anything. A couple of more focused issues. If you could go back to what Linda was asking us to look at, which was the before and after of the 2 sections, I think it was the Forsyth and the Eastern side. We can start with that one. So the existing East End. I think, breaking down Gainsborough and reconfiguring Cullinan and Hertig into bigger buildings that will relate to the new Matthews Arena and so forth makes a tremendous amount of sense. I did have a question. If you go to the next slide, the after slide, I think one of the things that's significant to me, and again, this is more formal than it is experiential, is the role that Hertig and Cullinan plays as a hinge between the grid of the Northeastern camp, the majority of the Northeastern campus, and the rest of the city, right, where Gainsborough and so forth, kind of fly off on a different angle. And I wonder about the spaces in between them. Again, that's getting a little bit to Kirk's point, like what is it like to be in those spaces? And those look like very big buildings. But is there an opportunity with Hertig and Cullinan to sort of, rather than just having those 2 buildings peel away from each other, is that a moment of opportunity to sort of formally express that change, that shift that's occurring, which I think would be orienting potentially to people who are moving through the campus or even seeing it from a distance. I think that could be an opportunity. And in plan, if you could go to the plan of that, I very much appreciate how the facade is sort of stepping up and out towards Mugar, but and I'm sure that territory is very precious. But I was wondering, again, I'm very interested in what it's like to move from the city into your campus, not across the campus, which was what Kirk was talking about, those cross connections, but actually from the South End Back Bay into the campus down St. Botolph Street, which is going to be obviously a much more important street with the construction of the new facilities there. I can't picture Mugar in my mind, but I wonder if that line of St. Botolph Street was actually held across those 2 other buildings, and Mugar was kind of like a destination at the end, and there was a little bit of a wedge-shaped public space that expanded towards Mugar. If that might not make the chicane into Robinson Quad a little less circuitous, and actually give you some sort of a sense of the long view. I guess I'm interested in this long view coming down St. Botolph Street into the campus. What does that look like? What does that feel like with the new athletic center, with those 2 new big buildings, and with Mugar, that's obviously one of your legacy buildings, sort of at the end. Like, what does that all feel like as someone coming in, and how would that potentially influence that orange zone? So that's my comment on the east end. If we could go to the Forsyth section for a moment. This was super helpful to me to understand that Huntington and Forsyth is really going to be, I think, the moment of identity of the campus for the city, right? For people moving up and down Huntington Avenue, this is that moment of a significant new buildings clustered around a new plaza on Huntington Avenue that helps me understand how 21 Forsyth, why that makes sense as a building that height, as an answer to Cabot and Forsyth, on the other side. I guess I'd really like to understand more about how you're seeing that moment in the city, at ground level. Like, what does that mean? Is that in fact, I think it's called Gateway Plaza, is in fact that the Gateway Plaza, is there like a big moment of art there? Like what's happening there that makes me understand? I feel like it's a nice distance from the MFA and the other quad that you have down Huntington. So sort of understanding that syncopation of public open spaces once you cross Mass Ave, going down Huntington Avenue, what's accessible to the public, what isn't, I think would help me understand how this is fitting into the city. And one question I do have is why Churchill Hall is there? It feels like it's maybe it's a really important building. I just want to understand. It seems like so much of what's being set up with the new architecture creates this really powerful diagonal connection towards the student center and Snell Library, and Churchill Hall feels like a brick in the middle of that move. And so I just kind of want to understand a little bit more about why that has to be. And those are really my comments. Those are just my questions at this point. I hope that's clear and or helpful.
And I'm going to pick up on some of the things that both Kirk and David have been talking about. So, so first of all, thank you for an extremely comprehensive and beautifully represented presentation. The campus does have a lot of incredible assets. One of the challenges of the campus that, of course, is universal understanding and accessibility and inclusiveness, not only from a physical perspective, but also I think from somewhat of a legibility perspective. I think you had a couple of diagrams in there that were showing the existing path network towards the end. We don't have to go to that actually at the moment, but showing that it's extremely complicated to navigate and to understand. Well, it isn't as difficult to navigate, but as to understand the navigation. So I certainly appreciate this, the strong move of the diagonals, but I think I would like to understand more about the connections between the diagonals. So actually just even staying in the one we were just looking at, but you could go to any of them, maybe like 20. So even staying on this one, jumping over Churchill, moving in front of Snell through the Curry Center, which is already challenging, and then the kind of the back lane service. So it's very, I'm not a regular user of the campus, but it's a very difficult comprehension of how you move through it. It's not illogical. It's not, a quad, a quad, a quad. So if the diagonals are becoming the major move, which themselves are very serpentine-like, how do you specifically address these connections in a stronger way? I'd also say the same with like even the connection along Botov Street. I was all saying Botov Street. I was also looking at that, and the character of the street. The character of it is quite a tight connection against I think personally I feel it's too tight a connection against the new athletic center, and then it widens out into some sort of somewhat amorphic plazas, and then it turns into a service road, and then you hit Mugar. So I think keeping some of it doesn't necessarily need to look like every other campus because it has incredible qualities in its own, but how is there enough legibility that it's easier for a student or a visitor to navigate it, that it doesn't take the first 2 months to figure out how to get around and move around the campus itself. So I would like to understand that sort of in the horizontal plane, but also in the vertical plane, because as you've mentioned, the accessible issues are pretty challenging, and I think this is an opportunity for sort of, because it's a master plan, bigger moves towards accessibility instead of, certainly I appreciate the ground floor being made as a public realm, pretty well everywhere. But some bigger moves towards these, the level changes in the buildings. And is there, I know there's building by building strategies. Is there more of a guiding principle for how those particular level changes are addressed? So that's something I'd like to learn more about going forward. I also you have an incredible arboretum and incredible legacy of trees and maintaining this tree palette on campus. With the new construction, obviously there's going to be trees coming down, but is there a specific strategy for how to replant the canopy and what to plant and how to plant it? Again, is it a building by building strategy, or is there a larger kind of guiding principle for how that might be addressed? And I'm not going to say it's the last thing I want to look at, because it's a very rich campus. It's a very rich plan, and it's exciting. But I also would like to understand Huntington, and is there a way that it can not only be a beautiful street and the campus, one of the campus's front doors, but also address the idea of it being part of the Avenue of the Arts, in terms of its guiding principles.
Donna, thanks for your comments. And while you're still on for another couple of minutes, I wanted to make a suggestion and see how the commissioners felt about this. This is a really big project, it's a big IMP, and I feel like we would benefit if we had some kind of subcommittees that were organized around different types of space. So I would make the suggestion that our next subcommittee would focus on all things open space. That would include some of our questions about connections. It would include some of our questions about even edges. And I think we'd be able to get into some of these kind of proposed open spaces and how they're framed in a more workshop-y type of discussion. And then I'd suggest then that the next subcommittee might be focused on some of the building massing, and I think we'll get at some of that inevitably through the open space conversation, but it might just give us a different focus. And because what I've been noticing in this meeting is that we're running it almost like a first presentation, like a full commission, talking about things we'd like to see. And I think it's just from the sheer kind of size of the project and how many things are going on. So this is a question to the commissioners, whether that feels like the right way to go forward.
I think, go ahead.
No. I mean, it seems it's interesting because a lot of times it's building massing first and then following open space. But I like the idea of open space leading, since it is so much of the student experience and the city's experience. So I unless my commissioners disagree, I think that is an interesting way to start approaching this. And I think the connections, the street connections, or the vertical connections would also be a big part of that too.
Yeah, I think we could do that. One thing I might suggest is a series of diagrams that follow the whole presentation, meaning little squares, little 10 vignettes, whatever the organizing principles are, because as we're thinking about open spaces, sorry, want to make sure we are also thinking about this idea of um, the organizing pathways and the hierarchies of place, and the inventory of spaces. So I think all that could fall under open space, but I think it also overlaps a couple of other kind of guiding principles for the organization of the campus, that I don't want to do open space in a vacuum, but I also don't want to do a smorgasbord. So if that makes sense, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, just to chime in, I think that could be fine. I do really feel like and that's because I'm not a campus planner, I really feel like I need to understand views. So the diagrams are fine, and it's, again, I'm not looking for every view of every corner of everything, but like the key key moments, the key aha moments of like, oh, this is how I get from here to there, that I know are in your minds, well, and are also in the presentation, but sort of giving some sense of visuals to them. And to that extent, the fact that we will be seeing the scale of the building massing in those views, that will set up a conversation for the building massing later. And I promise that we won't get derailed. But I think that could be super helpful. Little anecdote, Saint Botolph, for those of you who don't know this, Saint Botolph is the patron saint of borders and edges. True
Are you
story.
making this up, David?
I am not. I learned this because
You've been waiting for this moment.
I used to live on St. Botolph Street. And for a city that's known for its borders and boundaries, it was sort of an interesting, especially in the South End relative to the Back Bay, was really sort of an interesting discovery. So I just throw that in there because I have a particular interest in that view, that access point from St. Botolph Street. I think that was mentioned, maybe it's a little narrow in front of the rec center. I share that concern, but just that feeling of coming in from the public transportation, which does exist on Mass Ave, and not wanting to walk necessarily down Huntington Avenue, which is a busy street and is kind of a difficult street in that section, but kind of coming into that campus. That's why this slide being up is so provocative to me. I really do feel that this space, this orange space that is unnamed, is actually another gateway to the campus. And so I'd really like to understand what it feels like to arrive there.
I apologize with everyone, but I do have to jump off for another meeting.
Thanks, Shauna. And
Thank you.
Kathy, you've been really patient. So let's take your comments. I can't hear you, but
sorry,
there you go.
I
There
was
you go.
not unmuted. Sorry about that. Thank you. And I just love that. And I won't call it an anecdote. I think it's kind of interesting that St. Botolph has been interpreted that way. So thanks for that, David. And in fact, one of my comments focuses a little bit on borders and boundaries. And well, let me back up first of all and say, I wonder if the three big ideas, although I'm forgetting what number 3 was, might be a way of organizing the workshops that you're thinking of, Linda, because they seem to categorize certain aspects of the content that we're looking at. But that's just a random thought. But first of all, thank you for the presentation. I continue to marvel at how Northeastern adapts and grows this portion of the city and really just is very creative about it. I was intrigued by your big idea number 2 and your sustainability focus and your flows through the campus. And certainly we're focused on, I know, on the areas that where you will be focusing the majority of your development activity over the next several years. But I couldn't help but think that the north, well, actually, I'm not quite sure what the direction is of the sort of axial views or pathways through the campus to Columbus and to the Roxbury edge, but also the periphery of the campus as being areas to focus on, because I sense that that you have multiple gateways here. We all know that, but the edge along Ruggles Street is not always. It's got a very nice green path. It's got buildings with windows, and yet it seems, when I walk it, never to feel like it's a gateway to your campus. It seems like it's a place for deliveries, a place for driving in. Not necessarily one that welcomes the pedestrian flows along Ruggles. And I wonder about that. But I also have a similar feeling from Mass Ave and St. Botolph coming in. So therefore I'm sort of wondering the critical areas that in orange in the previous slide that we were talking about factors into that. But I also wonder how you plan on really seeing that flow all the way through, and what the experience to the center that you're focused on will be like from some of these edges that are fairly hard at the moment. So and don't appear to have that gateway quality that that I think your campus needs almost on every edge. I'm glad you're on this one, because I'm really curious, and always am, about the accessibility over the MBTA rails and the fact that your campus is so stretched. And I'm and really needs to be very deliberate about how you get over onto the other side. And I'm wondering what your limitations are and where the opportunities are around that, as it pertains to the concentrations that you're focused on for development, but generally speaking, how the pedestrian experience for anybody starting in Roxbury going to Huntington Avenue or the other way around might be made better through your planning. And then I have a small, just technical question. When you say renovation, are you just simply looking at renovating your buildings in their current form and mostly on the interiors, or is there more to be expected on existing buildings around the campus that you've noted?
Yeah, I can answer that quickly. Two of our latest amendments to the 2013 IMP were triggered by a major renovation, and and maybe that'll go away with the updating, the efforts that the Boston Planning Department has undertaken around modernizing Article 80. But there is this loophole that triggers that if the renovation is costly and it's more than half of the building's assessed value, then it triggers large project review. Or, and that happened to us one time, or if the uses, the total building is greater than 50,000 square feet, and that could end up being an IMP project, considered to be an IMP project. So our library renovation, the use didn't change, but we did renovate multiple stories, and it ended up costing more than half of the building's assessed value. It triggered IMP project review. So to avoid that, we're just putting in buildings that we know are on the list of the deferred maintenance plan, or that we foresee will need a major renovation to upgrade systems for labs. And so we're including that because everything is very costly and easily will trip that monetary threshold for a building renovation. But none of it is major changes of use.
Right.
It's just upgrading systems.
Yeah, Victoria, I thank you for that. I'm really interested in some of the buildings on campus that are really sort of coming into their own from a from an age and design standpoint, especially around the quad. And I think you had Dodge on there as a potential renovation. So your quad is really a major identifier for Northeastern. So I just want to understand whether or not that renovation stands to change any of the way that the buildings present to the public.
It's interesting that the quad is often viewed as the biggest identity piece, but there's a lot of discussion about access. From quad, it's actually very difficult to penetrate the campus. It is you wouldn't consider that as the gateway of how you enter the campus. There are other pathways that are much easier to navigate from accessibility perspective. And to an earlier point of what is your bike network through the campus, very few students bike through the campus because you're going to have to carry the bike up and down the stairs because they don't want to go the long ramp way or go around. Or they'll just grab their scooter. This is like the more popular way to get around now is the electric scooter. But there's just so much change of elevation that a lot of these pathways, as you can see here, get interrupted because it is not on the same elevation, so it's not a continuous line.
So Victoria, that what you just said, and piggybacking on what Kathy said, that's why I'm really interested in the relationship of the quad and the new Gateway Plaza. And in some ways, it makes me wonder if the gateway of the quad should be almost more privatized so that the Gateway Plaza is clearly the priority. I don't know. I'm just like trying to understand their relationship in the psychology. But what Kathy said, I just want to second a very important point that she made, which is, of course, I care about how everything functions through the campus and what it's like for students and or visitors to move through the campus and to get from point A to point B. And I know that you're thinking very much about that and hard about that. But as a citizen, Boston citizen, what I care about is the edges of the campus and how they relate to the city. And so what Kathy was mentioning about Ruggles Street is very true. I know that we had a lot of discussion around 840 Columbus and how that could be more inviting. And I thought that was a very successful conversation. And I'm looking forward to that project getting built. But I really think from a BCDC point of view, while I do care, obviously, about all these networks and things like that, I am really particularly fascinated about what it means to move around, to be around this campus, like you're around Harvard's campus or BU's campus, and every day, and understanding how open or welcoming the campus is on all sides, right? Like all around it. And that's where I think that the discussion about, Ruggles and St. Botolph Street is really interesting, at least to me, because that's probably how I see the campus most often, as someone who doesn't work there or study there. So something to think about.
Yeah, and this was a great presentation and a ton of things for us to be thinking about. I'll add a few of my comments to my colleagues. The first one is about this kind of legibility that keeps popping up in our conversation today. And I think about, when you look at this diagram, for instance, you realize that Northeastern is a series of kind of 3 flashlight shapes that are laid next to each other. But you would never know that walking the campus. You would never perceive that. It's only legible through this plan view. And I think because of all the different geometries that you're dealing with and trying to solve, it's really hard to make the campus legible. And so I think all of us are recognizing that and trying to kind of sleuth out some solutions with you all in our conversations. I think, Marianne, you presented the principles at the beginning, kind of kicked us off in that way. And principle 3 and 5 seem to be the areas that we're focusing a lot on in our discussion right now, and really trying to understand the connections and within the campus and also the connections to the rest of the city as David was just talking about. And I think it would really be helpful to dig into those as we continue to meet with you all. A couple of other things I'd love to learn more about in future subcommittees. When you popped up slide 7, maybe we can go to that. I think one thing that would be good for us to understand is what the enabling projects are. So we know that the East End is maybe enabling other projects to happen, and there are some moving parts that need to be done first. And I think giving us a sense of what that is could help us understand why you're phasing things the way you are. And I'll add to that comment that even though this feels like a plan that's much longer than 10 years, or maybe you guys will surprise us and build all of this in 10 years. I actually think it's really helpful for us to have that long view. So maybe this is a 20-year plan, but for us to understand how you're getting to that place and what you're building first, and again, what the enabling projects are, I think is a really helpful way for us to understand the project as a whole. On slide 10, when you look at this slide, and part of it is just like the coloring, I think, just the colors that are being used. But I'm really curious to learn more about the Bernstein-Rubenstein height, because it looks incongruous to the other heights around it. And I'm wondering why you chose that height. So maybe when we talk about massing, we could talk about that. And then slide 14. This really goes to maybe the overarching comment that I have, which is because you've got all these shifting geometries and you've inherited buildings where they are, and you're dealing with a complex kind of urban environment, what happens is that the buildings tend to interrupt the open space. So David's comment earlier about, Churchill being that brick that basically interrupts what could be a really, not only just a wonderful open space, but actually a legible way to get through the campus, I think is the most, dissatisfying part of the current Northeastern campus, is that you feel like you're onto something, right? And then all of a sudden you dead end at a building, and you have to make this decision about how to get around the building and what's on the other side of the building, and are you even heading in the right direction? And knowing that you've inherited a lot of these challenges and are trying to solve some of these, and I loved this diagram to help express it, I get really confused when we get to the East End, because here you're providing yourself with an opportunity to create a new design, new urban design elements, new massing. And I feel like what's happening is that Cullinane and Hertig gives us that other interruption. It doesn't give us the opportunity to actually solve some of the endemic kind of wayfinding issues through the campus. And so I really want to dig into that. What were the decisions around not kind of shifting Cullinane Hertig up towards St. Botolph, and even looking at the kind of massing of Gainsborough in order to create kind of a south-facing open space that would be more continuous and wouldn't introduce kind of that canyon that we're seeing here between Cullinane and Hertig. And I believe what's happening with Gainsborough is that you're creating an auditorium in the ground floor. So I get that it needs to have a certain dimension, but it just seems like, if we're creating an opportunity for new form, and we know that we have this challenge throughout campus of getting through it, knowing where you are in space and having these long views, why couldn't this be an opportunity to have a creative solution to that? So I really want to learn more about that. And then a lot of the other comments have already been talked about, but I'll just add one more, and that's about the service corridor that runs along the T. And I'd love to know more about that. I mean, I've walked it several times, and you can kind of you can kind of get on the other side of the library that way, right? You kind of wiggle past, and then you've got the rail on one side and then kind of the back door of a lot of these buildings. And I want to understand it. And I also want to understand some of these longer spurs that come from it. For instance, we can see it in this diagram where we see it coming past the Curry Center and kind of penetrating pretty deep into the campus there, right? That you're crossing that service corridor. And so I just would love to know about that and whether you guys have thought about maybe continuing it. I think Ryder probably gets in the way, but continuing it all the way to Ruggles, or, you know, does that offer us an opportunity to get some of these blue lines out of the center of campus and again, improving some of the legibility? I would love to kind of learn about more. But you guys have taken on a really complex project, and the diagrams are really helpful in helping us to understand it. I just am hoping that maybe some of these new buildings can help us solve some of the problems. For instance, I think that the Forsyth and Huntington corner, you know, that 100% corner that you're introducing is really fabulous. And you've pulled back the buildings and allowed that presence of open space or even a view into the campus to occur there. And I think that solves a problem. And so I'd love to see more of that on over by Cullinane and Gainsborough too. Commissioners have any other comments before we ask for public comment? Christina, do we have any public comment?
At this time, we'd like to invite any members of the public in attendance who may wish to contribute public testimony, excuse me, to raise your digital hand and staff will call on you. If you're calling in by phone, dial *9 to activate the raise hand function and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. Please state your name and any relevant project affiliation information, and please keep your comments to 2 minutes. Allison Pultinas, we see your hand raised. Let us promote you to co-host here. See if you can unmute yourself. Allison, are you able to unmute?
Oh, yes, thank you. Just a couple of follow-up points, because I'm also on the campus a lot. Thinking that it's very important to think about where people are getting on transit. And the Huntington Avenue Northeastern Green Line stop in front of the quad, the Ruggles Station stop, and then people go downstairs and walk up Forsyth and can transfer to the Green Line at Huntington, and the Mass Ave Route 1 connection and the Ruggles bus connections. Those all seem very relevant for the public, and how you know, the views through campus point that it seems to tie that into those transit stops is important. Also just thinking again about bikes, and because the topography is so up and down internally across campus, that some of the buildings with stairs, you certainly could add those channels that people do for bike access, and that 2 questions related to mobility, both the MBTA bridge that leads over to Carter Playground, and what's going to happen there with the bridge work, and the Ruggles bike path. I know there was a plan, and I believe it's the city, but also with the university to do a bike connection to Parker Street from Columbus, and that would go through the double row of oaks there, and what's happening with that. And one more fast point, Burstein Rubenstein, I assume also includes the Punter's Pub site, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Any other comments? Okay, commissioners, we'll consider the public testimony portion closed for the evening.
Hey, Linda, I did have one more thing I wanted to raise, and I hope we can talk about. It's the access from Columbus, and in particular the Plaza, Science Plaza, which to me is so important because it's sort of midway between the two major edges of the campus. And so I'd love to understand how easy it is to penetrate the campus from the lower Roxbury side, and how we animate what's on the other side, whether it's on the other side as you walk out of Ruggles Station and the character of that open space right there. I don't know, you can bring up, I'm sorry, we don't need to go back to diagrams, or how you get across that bridge from Science. Yeah, that's great, thank you. So obviously the mid-campus connection is the one, the yellow line there, that I don't really have a sense of that. I've never done that, but it strikes me you get to the other side and then you're stuck at one of these decision tree moments. And then the comment about Ruggles Street is, as you spill out of Ruggles, sort of the character of how you animate that open space right there at the end, at the roundabout or the circle. But the space, the actual green space next to it, to give people a reason. So I guess to summarize my comment, it's understanding that this is a fairly deep campus as opposed to a more linear campus like, say, BU. The question is, what is the rhythm of activities and the hierarchy of places that gives you a reason to penetrate the campus and to keep going? So that's the only comment I want to make. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. So, Christina, I think we do a little bit more thinking, consideration for how we structure the future subcommittees. And, Corey and Victoria and Marianne, I think the goal there is to give you guys more tangible feedback. And so if we end up doing open space for the first one, that's how we'll focus. And I think David's suggestion that part of the open space helps us to kind of frame those views is a really good one, because I think it helps us to understand the planar and extruded kind of forms, and also might also help us to understand where all of the topographic changes are, which are super critical to how you guys plan there too. And then maybe we do a massing, and then maybe there's kind of maybe an urban design subcommittee that brings it all together. But as you guys know, there's a ton of information here, and we just want to be as responsive as we can be. So does it make sense, Christina, for us to kind of take that offline and see what works for commissioners and the proponent? And then
Yeah,
make on from there. Okay.
I think so. Victoria and Corey will follow up with you guys to talk about scheduling. Glad that we're also joined by other members of the Northeastern community.
Brian agrees.
Brian agrees. I think we have to think about this a little bit. I think what would make sense for open space subcommittee would be to actually include ground floor and some of the uses, because as the campus evolved over decades and decades, from parking lot, white brick building, parking lot, white brick building, I think the solution for us for a more connected campus is actually opening up the ground floors even more, as that will be critical in creating a continuous passageway. Without that, we would have to be demoing every single building and starting from scratch. And there are just a lot of topo kind of challenges, especially in the core, right? As you get from Krensman into the core where the student center is. So I think we can definitely develop series that will clarify some of these challenges. Over the last decade in the IMP, the focus to connect Columbus Avenue and Lower Roxbury to Huntington Avenue side of the campus was really the major focus. The MBTA is also redoing Ruggles Station, which would increase accessibility and would become a much more attractive connector. You can definitely connect across, but it is not something you would choose to do unless you knew exactly what you were doing and where you're going. So we're definitely can focus on those and focus on the Ruggles Street as an edge. There are definitely wayfinding things that we're looking at internally, because that is the way you arrive as a visitor to the visitor center, is from the Ruggles Street. And then we've talked a lot about St. Botolph and the importance of that as part of the arena review. You know, I think as we come back with the arena, you might find a pleasantly surprising how we opened up the arena on that side. So when we're ready in January to come back with the arena, I think you will see it more as a gateway of what it is, and we should be able to respond to that. But if we do come back with this, you know, two separate subcommittees on, you know, ground floor and public realm, and then another one on building massing, I don't think we can talk about just open space without the program on the ground floor and how things get connected.
I like this idea of doing more of a NOLI plan, Victoria, because I think that it does help us to understand even what's coplanar, you know, like,
Right.
you know, where do we start and where do we end up as we go through a building? So I think that would be really helpful.
That's music to Marianne's ears, you know that.
And I think this idea of hierarchy is so important. When you talk about opening up the ground floors, I agree, but there's certainly activating open spaces on that edge of a building, as opposed to the narrow edge. You know, just, you know, it's almost maybe it's three colors, you know, red, green, blue, whatever you like, that sort of show where you're focusing intensity of porosity and an active program that would encourage somebody to be in that open space, because you say this is important to getting through the campus. So anyway, just yeah, I think we're all talking the same talk here.
Just to emphasize that point even more, I still have this image up on my screen, and I think what you don't see, having, you know, maybe not being as familiar with the campus, is one of our primary freeways is actually through the Curry Center. Like, we get so much foot traffic just cutting through, and so you don't see that in kind of an open space map that's highlighting these pedestrian paths. But when you start to think about those ground floors, you really do understand that there are these kind of cut throughs of the buildings that, you know, are quite public. That's intentionally a space that's public and folks can come through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that NOLI plan will, I think almost an annotated NOLI plan will help us with that, right? So the color that you use for exterior open space might be applied to interior open space. I see Marianne nodding, just to help us to understand where those are. But again, I think we have to understand, well, you may enter Curry at a certain elevation, but you won't necessarily exit out to that plaza at the same elevation. So maybe there's a graphic trick that you can introduce there to help us understand that too. Thanks for staying long with us. I don't think any of us thought we could get out of here in 60 minutes, but
it's a great project.
Yeah, it is a great project.
Well, thank you all for your feedback. Much appreciated. We look forward to being back.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays to you too. We'll see you in the new year.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.